heard from today here have been the success stories. They've been the people who've managed to find the chink, the opportunity, the one unusual place where there happens to be the soil association and otherwise a kind of impregnable fortress of too expensive land, or people who are en route to do some sort of community buyouts. And when I was mentioning that which applied to Egg, which was that the original trustees couldn't be from the island, I was thinking about even our arrangements for this event. And some of the people that we'd wanted to come to speak simply felt too nervous to do it. Some of them did have a large series of allotments that are leased and didn't want to jeopardise that arrangement by seeming to come to an event that was looking at land reform. Another one is fairly active in trying to detect wildlife crime in areas of Angus, and again didn't want to come here and be detectable effectively because they want to keep walking the land. We had another example where there was a legal dispute about harbours, not obviously in inland Perthshire, but in one of the events that's soon to come. And again, because those people are actively trying to renew their lease with the landowner, they didn't want to speak about it. And actually the places where there are effectively sometimes most difficulty and most active issues, particularly to do with housing, and there isn't an anchor organisation, as Linda mentioned earlier, that's up and at it and recognised, the more difficult it is for people to voice up. And I think that's a bit of a difficulty. What we were trying to show today is simply that when people, local people, have got access to the same land assets that would be in with the bricks in most of our neighbouring countries at this latitude, people make a fair old fist of it. And the track record has been proven to be pretty good. You then have to wonder how to make that not the exception, but the rule. And actually, despite all the talk that we've had of community buyouts, that too is a series of exceptions. I appreciate everyone is waiting for the Norway mention. Here it is, and then it'll be over. But in countries like Norway, there are no community land buyouts because the taxation system works. And because very small local councils own land, which is cooperatively owned for everybody. It put me in mind of one little story that I just want to tell, because it involves both lupins and this part of the world. And my thanks to Craig for bringing up the beautiful lupin flower, because the reason I sort of got kind of involved with lupins was really Ron Greer. Now some of you may know Ron, who took it upon himself to plant groups of lupins all the way up the A9 to basically try to shore up some of the surfaces which were crumbling with the creation and extension of the roads, and also across the piece with overgrazing, which has turned the area above Kelvin into a desert. His interest in life is the Arctic char. And believe me, I think Ron would be quite proud to say he can bore for the universe on the Arctic char. It's a fish, by the way. And it's having its problems in Scotch lochs, where it used to be kind of quite abundant. And he thinks some of the reason for that is because of the lack of leaf litter falling into the lochs. And the reason for that is the lack of trees beside the lochs. And the reason for that very often is terribly overgrazing. So he took a little bit of land along up beside, which loch was it under again?
Garry.
Sorry?
Loch Garry.
Initially, and managed to get it for rental, for lease for about 20 years. I managed to get a portion of it sort of sectioned off, fenced off so the little teeth couldn't get at it. And first of all planted lupins, right, see this is where I came in, and Scotch broom, because both of these return nitrogen to the soil, give some shelter to the little saplings that are trying to grow, and they generally help the growth of the saplings that are coming through. So I wish I'd actually had the sequence of photographs that shows you what happened. First year, yep, there was loads of lupins. Second year, there was loads of Scotch broom. Everyone thought the trees were dead. 5 years later, beginnings of a little forest. And 10 years later, a very established forest of a variety of deciduous trees, many of them Norwegian, sorry, there's the second mention, because the way our climate's moving, those seem to be more adaptable types of trees. And it's a beautiful little woodland. He took me out to show me. It's got wild strawberries, dragonflies. It's a very mixed, little place. And it could have been what the whole of Perthshire looked like. if a subsequent plan, very ambitious plan, to take over 100,000 acres of Perthshire had succeeded. The aim, having proved this, was to do the same sort of technique across that whole area as land became available, and 100,000 acres was available. So the idea was to buy it as a land trust. It would, if pollarded properly and used as a wood resource, it would have made this village, Dunkeld and Pitlochry, energy self-sufficient within 20 years. And it was quite an exciting prospect. It would mean the enchanted forest up the road. We're not the only people who had a gig. You would all have had the beautiful maples and the colours and the autumn colours too. So this looked so promising that people began to get strangely optimistic, even Scots. Scottish Enterprise got involved, so you might see how this is going to end. And eventually someone from Scottish Enterprise asked the two guys doing this, Derek and Ron, did either of them have academic qualifications? And they didn't. They just had done it, that's all. And somewhere around that, the whole project foundered. The opportunity was missed, the funding was withheld, and the 100,000 acres went back into the private sector. And, you know, the reason I say this, I went out with Ron to have a look at that site, which is now through 3 padlocked gates, because it's along a part of land which I think the sheikh of somebody that Andy might know of owns. And it's quite difficult to get to. And it's difficult for Ron because he put 20 years of his life into that. And actually it just sits there now as a suggestion of what might have happened. Just to add further insult to injury, and it does explain why Ron is slightly barking, and again I think he'd be perfectly alright with me saying that, so vaguely proud of being eccentric, is that they had suggested doing the same at the Rest and Be Thankful 20 years ago, 25 years ago, and that was rejected. It could have helped stabilise that as well, which is subject to endless landslides. So, I mean, behind all of this, you know, it's so hard to say what might have been, because we can only see what has been tried. We cannot often say what has failed, and we can hardly say what's yet to come. And the only thing that I think I'd like to say as well is just what the capacity might be for a different feeling about ourselves, a different experience of life. And there's the other thing about huts. As some of you may know, I'm doing a PhD comparing the huts of third mention, Norway and Scotland. In Norway, it's perfectly normal to escape to a little wooden cabin. In fact, you're pretty odd if you don't. In Scotland, there are 500. In Norway, same population, there are 452,000. The difference? I wonder. It's got quite a lot to do with access to land and for the appetite to want to be on it. And the horrible thing is that that one goes. Just as we were hearing there about the skills that have to be relearned now, if you don't keep your hand in anything, not only the skills go, but the appetite goes. And I'm left here thinking, having listened to that fabulous music from Craig and Tommy, about another fabulous musician, 2 musicians, one of whom you know, Dougie MacLean, lad at the parish, and Michael Mara, who died 2 years ago. And the reason, sorry, every time I mention Mike, I get a bit like this, but I'm going to go on. The reason that Mike and Dougie knew each other is because Mike's family had a caravan, as some of you may know, up at the back, up the road to Trochry. And that was what allowed Mike in the summers to come down and meet this gallus guy called Dougie MacLean. And that's how the two of them met. And in fact, the reworking of that song, Neil Guy's Apprentice, comes from that meeting. And there could be more. There could be much more of this. It could be going on all the time, not just some of the time. And that's the future. It has to be the future. Because what else are we here for? I give you Andy Wightman.
Great, thank you very much indeed, Lesley, and splendid. Thank you very much for the invitation to come along here. Today my name is Andy Wightman. I've been working on land issues for a quarter of a century, and earlier this year in May I got my first proper job, which is quite nice. Anyway, first of all I want to express my gratitude to Lesley for getting this whole Ireland gig off the something last year. It's off the road, off the ground. Last year, I think it's tapped into a lot of very, very latent interest and excitement in this topic. And if you've got one message I want to give you today, it's that if land reform is going to happen, it's not going to happen because I'm in Parliament or anything else. It's going to happen because thousands and thousands and thousands of people want it to happen, because that's how democracy works. So thank you very much, Lesley. Right, I'm just going to give a wee presentation because I wasn't really sure what I was going to do here today until I arrived here. I'm just going to give a wee short presentation on 5 things that I think are very important in the bigger picture to consider in regard to land. That's information, economic impacts, housing, democracy and tax. And some of you will heard some of this before, so I apologise. But I'm just starting with a slide, not of Burnham, but of Kinghorn, just because the last talk I gave was from Kinghorn. And it emphasises the fact that common land, community-owned land, is a very, very old thing. So in places like Kinghorn, going right back to the Borough Charter in the 16th century, they had town links, bleaching greens and all the rest of it. And so what we're actually doing here today and through our land programme is actually rediscovering old traditions of community-owned land. The other important thing that's happened over the last 5 years or so is that land is not just a rural thing, it's an urban thing. And also increasingly, and that's why the picture is the biggest one, it's a marine thing. So that's all Scotland in the yellow there. And the powers over the management and governance of that Crown land are going to come to the Scottish Parliament very, very soon. And we're going to have to make decisions about how we manage that vast marine estate. And in my view, that's very, very exciting. Land is also extraterrestrial. I don't own any land on planet Earth, but I do own a bit of the moon. And I bought it for £12.95 in Safeways a few years ago. And it's in quadrant F4 in the Oceanus Procellarum, on the lighted side of the moon. And this is not so fanciful because actually, although the 1967 Outer Space Treaty prohibits states from appropriating celestial bodies, and that was passed to prevent the militarisation of space, it doesn't actually apply to individuals, of course, because they weren't parties to it. And there are American corporations who are wanting to gain property rights in outer space. One of them, for example, landed, when the Schumacher probe landed on a little asteroid called Eros and sent back data to NASA, and then its battery died, and the Schumacher probe is still sitting on Eros today, as far as we know. But this company in California had registered a title ownership to Eros. And so when this happened, they sent an invoice to NASA for rental charges for parking the probe. And there are American corporations who want to rip up the Outer Space Treaty because out in outer space there are literally asteroids flying around with more titanium and platinum on them than the whole of planet Earth combined. So that's the next new frontier for land grabbing. So first of all, information. I started this whole journey because I couldn't get good information on who owned land in Scotland. And it's really ironic that at the end of the 19th century, Parliament was holding inquiries into the ownership of land and heritage, published a huge list. Lloyd George, in his famous People's Budget just over 100 years ago, proposed a land tax which involved the necessity of surveying the whole of Great Britain and Ireland. And they did that in 4 years, and they plotted the ownership, use and value of every single square inch of the whole of Great Britain and Ireland with paper maps and ink pens in 1910 to 1914. And this is one of the maps produced, some of you recognise this as the West End of Edinburgh, Charlotte Square. So we knew more about who owned Scotland and Britain and Ireland, the whole of Ireland, in 1910, 1914 than we do now, which is somewhat ironic. Now, of course, the land register is up and operating, but it still only covers 28% of Scotland. And the other thing is all this information should be open and freely available to the public. Even when it's completed, it's not going to be available to the public unless for charge. And you won't be able to see this, but if you go home tonight, or even now, if you've got a decent internet connection, you can go into the Montana, that's the state of Montana in the US, their cadastral survey, Montana Cadastral, and you can find 158 different bits of information about every single plot of land in the whole of the state of Montana, like here in Burnham. You cannot even do that for Burnham. And that's that. So I think information and making information public available is actually the principal thing we have to do over the next 5 years, because we're not an informed public and citizenry if we don't know who owns our country. Secondly, the economics are going to be really, really important going forward, particularly in the aftermath of the EU referendum result. Back in '97, when who's this guy? Gordon Brown gave his first budget. He said, I will not allow house prices to get out of control. It had been a big boom and bust in the early 90s. When he retired or left as Chancellor, 10 years later they trebled, so he failed. George Osborne, I was going to say our current Chancellor, but things are moving so fast I don't even know who our current Chancellor is, but anyway, he was our Chancellor until recently. He went to Dublin in 2006 and gave a speech in Trinity College, Dublin, in which he said that Ireland stands as a shining example of the art of the possible in long-term economic policy making. Within 2 years, Ireland had crashed and burnt. And so this is a level of ignorance of our policymakers and the role that land plays in the economy. And as it was put in the Financial Times a couple of years later, Daniel Gardner wrote, at the height of the lunacy, around 3/4 of the total lending by Irish banks, 420 billion euros, or about 2.5 times the size of the Irish economy, got bound up in property construction and land speculation. A sort of northern rock on steroids. And that's what happened to Ireland. It over-leveraged, it speculated on land, it crashed and burnt. Many people lost their life savings, they emigrated from Ireland. So that's how important land is in all of this. And of course, one of the reasons we're heading for another crash is the level of personal debt in Britain. So personal debt now, this is 2013, is £1.5 trillion. That's mainly mortgages secured in property. That is unsustainable. House prices are going to drop, interest rates are going to go up, and there's going to be a lot of pain and suffering as a consequence of that. But we could plan an orderly transition if we wanted to. Unfortunately, a lot of the electorate are not interested in the politics of falling house prices, which would help young people get a house, because they regard it as a part of their savings. And that's another big challenge we have to face in terms of economic impacts. And that leads me neatly onto housing, because from my point of view, housing is one of the crux issues, where land is a very, very vital ingredient of this. And if you look at a graph of house building from post-war 1946, you can see in the blue in the bottom there, that's private house building, and the red is local councils. And you can see the vast amounts of homes we built in Britain, up until the 1970s and 80s. Then we had council house right to buy, that killed off local authorities building houses. The housing associations in pink appeared, but by 2008, with the crash, levels of house building in Britain have declined dramatically. But that little thin line shows you house prices. So as we build less houses, house prices go up. And we've got to challenge this because, as I said, £1.5 trillion of private debt in Britain, which could be invested in British industry instead of the land market. This is why we need to sort this out. And if you look at a graph of what an average UK building worker in 1930 could pay for a house, they could buy a house for 3.5 times their average earnings. So average earnings today are about £25,000. So in other words, they could buy a house for about £85,000. Good quality house, 3-bedroom house for £85,000. Now it's 7.5. So we've got a generation of very great wealth inequality between the haves and the have-nots, the asset rich and the asset poor. And the only ingredient in this that's causing that is land. Because when you look at the costs of building houses, this is a graph showing between 1983 and 2007. Along the bottom there are earnings and building costs. They've barely changed. It costs the same to build a house now broadly as it did 25 years ago. But what has changed is land prices. And one of the reasons is because we have 90% of new homes in Britain are built by the speculative volume housing industry, the speculative volume housing industry, which I want to eliminate entirely within 20 years. It's recognised as a failed model, and one of the reasons is because it is principally a land speculator. That's its principal line of business. Building houses is a kind of necessary inconvenience at the end. And of course, the developer that pays most for land gets the land. That means they've got less to pay for housing. And that's why the quality of British homes, the size of British homes has been in steady decline, the density of build has been in steady decline. And of course, this is speculative, so the customer has got no control over what they're buying. This is in contrast to all of the rest of Europe, where self-build is at 50, 60, 70, 80% of new homes are self-built. That's not you building a house yourself, that's you being the customer and procuring it and being in control of the process of what kind of house you want, levels of insulation you want, cost of running, longevity of design, and all the rest of it. And if you look at Germany, in blue there, that's German house prices since 1970. And in real terms, German house prices are exactly the same today as they were in 1970. Whereas in red, that's British house prices. Now there's a reason why Germany is a very, very successful economy. One of the reasons is it does not pour trillions and trillions of pounds into domestic property. It puts that money into German industry, and at the same time people are able to afford very, very high quality homes. And a secret to that And this is an illustration of some homes in a town called Freiburg in Germany. Secret to that is a post-war reform which we imposed on Germany and on ourselves, which was that public authorities, municipalities, could acquire land at what's called existing use value. So if you had agricultural land at £1,000 an acre, that's what the council buy it at. That means that 99% of the money you spend on the house is actually spent on the house. It means you can build a very high quality house, one that's going to last 150 years, not 60 years, etc. Germany still does that. Germany still does that, and that's why 85% of German house costs are actually the house. That's why they've got high quality homes that are affordable. Whereas in Britain it's as low as 40%. So about 50-60% is the cost of land, and that's why we're building crap homes, and that's why young folk can't afford it. So two things I want to achieve in Parliament on housing, there's many things, but one is the scourge of holiday homes. I want to make that a new use class in planning, so you have to get planning consent to change a domestic dwelling. And you find in rural areas houses being sold for £250,000. If they had to apply for a change of use, the council could say we don't want more than 5% of properties to be holiday homes. Its value would crash to about 100,000 and local folk could afford it. It's simple, it's not just a rural issue, it's an urban issue. It's happening in the heart of Edinburgh. The old town and the grass market are turning into party zones and Airbnbs, and the resident population is slowly being driven out. And the other thing we want to do is repeal the 1959 and 1961 Acts that ended the existing use value provisions in Britain, so that now landowners get the full uplift value when planning permission is granted. So land that's worth £2,000 an acre can be worth £2 million an acre overnight, and they get all that. So we want to end it and go back to the German model, in fact go back to the model we introduced in 1947. And that will transform the housing market in Scotland. Democracy is another really important thing, having people engaged in the democratic process. Lesley's done a lot of work on this. You look at municipal government across Europe and we're the most concentrated partner of municipal government. Countries like Belgium, which are much smaller, in fact Belgium is smaller than Highland Council area, 589 municipalities. Norway with the same population, 431, etc. These are places where people have a meaningful connection with the local municipality and with their elected members, whether it be the French communes or the Spanish municipios. And this is very well illustrated, this decline in Fife. If you look at from 1500 to 1894, there were 26 councils in Fife. Then we give parish councils a statutory footing, and that's the closest we ever had to municipalities as well as the town councils, and went up to 82. Then we abolished parish councils, 1930, went down to 33, basically the county and the town councils. Then in 75 we eliminated local government in Scotland. We don't have anything. We don't have local government in Scotland. It's not local and it doesn't govern. So we abolished local government. We abolished local government in 1975. And we're down to 3 districts in the region. Then we got rid of the thingamies and imposed a unitary authority. We're just down to 1 council serving 5. There's a trend here which I don't need a graph to notice. There are some in Scottish politics, including in the government, who'd happily see Fife Council disappear as well. And I think this is one of the biggest challenges we have over the next 5-10 years, is to turn around this insidious diminution in local democracy. If we'd kept our parishes, if we kept our town councils, we'd have 871 municipalities in Scotland. That would be normal, and it would place us bang in the middle of the kind of European distribution. I just want to say one thing is here to the people in Kirriemuir. Where are they? They're still here. Great. So now you see, when J.M. Barrie gifted the Camera Obscure to Kirriemuir, he gifted it to the Kirriemuir Town Council. That means it's part of the common good of Kirriemuir. So when you're talking about asset transfer and stuff, this already belongs to you. This is part of the common good of Kirriemuir, as is the Den as well. When I did a big survey of common land in Scotland's boroughs in 1975, I wasn't doing it then, 2005, Angus Council said there's no common good land in Kirriemuir. One of the obligations of the Community Empowerment Act is for councils to have a statutory register of common land in Scotland's towns. So it's an important thing. And also, I mean, the kind of work these people are doing is effectively the work that Kirriemuir Town Council, had it not been abolished, would be doing now. I like to think, and in fact they're taking the place of the hollowing out of our local democracy. Places like St Andrews, they're ancient common lands, the St Andrews Links, famous rabbit wars here, where the town went bankrupt and leased its land out to a rabbit farmer, and these 18-hole golf courses turned into 50 and 100-hole golf courses. There were so-called rabbit wars, when local citizens literally attacked the rabbit wardens with golf clubs, led to House of Lords cases and all the rest of it. Edinburgh, my hometown, with the Common Good Fund of the city acquired the land on which the new town's built. In Glasgow, the Common Good Fund built the trams that built the water supply. We used to be good at this kind of stuff. Eastern Perthshire and Alyth, this is the townsfolk of Alyth marching up on the hill, the Common of Alyth, to defend the Common against encroachment by farmers in 1949. This is a local councillor, Mark Crichton, cutting the fences. He was detained by the Alyth Constabulary overnight for that. Questions were asked in the House of Commons. Nothing of this is new. We've been here before. This is a piece of common land I found in Lanarkshire on the Black Law, at the top of the Black Law. Nobody knew this existed, not even the Carluke Parish Historical Society. What was interesting about it was part of the Black Law wind farm, which is the biggest wind farm in Europe at the time. I contacted Scottish Power and of course asked them why they hadn't put a wind farm in the Common. They said because they didn't know who to sign the lease with, and of course the people in Carluke didn't know they owned this land, and therefore they didn't ask for the turbine. And this is the level of ignorance that's actually built into our communities. That's a piece of land there, could easily have had a turbine or two, and earning the folk in Carluke several £1,000s. In contrast, as Lesley says, places like Norway, and this is Hemsedal Commune in Norway, population 2,200, governs itself. 12.8% of your income tax goes straight to the commune, so the people you meet at a meeting like this, or in the pub, or in the shop, or picking your kids up from school, are the people who spend half your income tax. Most of you will be paying, I don't know, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, £10,000 a year income tax. Half of that is paid by people that you'll meet when you walk down the street in Burnham Home, and that's a very, very different situation to what pertains here today. And finally, tax. This is very important. I think we need to make tax changes to housing, for example. For example, there's no capital gains tax on domestic dwellings. That costs us about £15 billion a year in Britain. That's more than the social security budget that George Osborne wanted to save. People get to keep all the profits selling the principal residence. That just increases inequality. And silly things like derelict buildings don't pay, and empty industrial buildings don't pay non-domestic rates, and yet this is one of the Our Land sites from last year in Glasgow, in Morrison Street, the old co-op building. And yet when it goes on fire, they expect the fire brigade to put it out, the police to maintain order, the courts to be available to adjudicate on any legal matters or insurance claims. In other words, everyone that owns property relies on the state to protect it. Ultimately, they require an army, a navy and an air force to defend the country against alien invasion. And that is the value of your property. Your value of your property is only the value that is capable of being exercised by the protections that are around it, including the land registry, including a system of law, including an effective democracy, including police and fire and rescue, including ultimately an armed force. So we need to make reforms here. One of the stories I came across recently was, some of you have heard this, but in Denmark they pay a land tax. They pay 2 land taxes actually, and every square inch of land in Denmark pays it. And the interesting thing is that Danes also pay on land they own outside Denmark. So I contacted SCAT, to the Danish tax authorities, and said how many Danish citizens own land in Britain from whom, because they were running a campaign to persuade Danes to declare land they owned outside Denmark. The Nordic Council was okay because they shared all that information, but folk who owned a holiday villa on the Costa del Sol, or indeed a Scottish estate, they relied on them to voluntarily declare that. And I can't remember the exact number, I think it was something like 58 Danish citizens had declared it. I said, you've probably got 58 Danish citizens in a couple of boroughs of London alone. I said, there's 400,000 acres of land in Scotland owned by Danish citizens. If you want to go in some kind of profit sharing agreement, I can help you to identify at which point they got a wee bit nervous about who they were speaking to. But anyway, this chap here in the top right is Anders Paulsen. He's soon probably going to become the second largest landowner in Scotland. He owns 198,000 acres of land now. I'm sure he's paying his grid tax. I'm sure he is. No reason to doubt it, he is. And it makes him the only landowner in Scotland of rural land who's paying any tax at all. The irony is, of course, he's not paying it to Highland Council or Angus Council. He's paying it to Esbjerg municipality in Denmark to build beautiful kindergartens for children like that in the bottom right. And of course, this land's been exempt since the 1950s when they got an agricultural exemption. The 90s, the sporting rates went out. That's coming back at least. But the government's got no appetite for reintroducing agricultural rates because of the vested interest in the power of the farming lobby and the landowning lobby. And yet it is directly responsible for the inflated land values of agricultural land because it's tax-free. And that's keeping out, just like young folk in housing, it's keeping young folk out of agriculture. So final thoughts. Land reform, I think it's important we know what we're talking about. This is the definition I use. Land, you know what land is, urban, rural, marine stuff. Reform, it's about reform, so it's about reforming the relationship between land and society Through legal mechanisms, that's tenure, so things like the Private Rented Housing Act, Community Empowerment Act, feudal abolition. Fiscal, that's taxation, how we tax land, how those systems are designed. And political, decision making. Who's making decisions about land? Ministers in Edinburgh, local authorities, who's making these decisions and how accountable they are about issues to do with the ownership and use of land. And the Land Reform Review Group defined land reform as measures that modify or change the arrangements governing the possession and use of land in the public interest. I think that's quite a good definition. So this was our land contribution. You'll see this in the papers. Maybe it's still owned in the British Virgin Islands. There's land in the waterfront in Edinburgh that should have houses on it, for the thousands of people that need homes. But it's now owned in the British Virgin Islands. No one really knows who's behind it, and are unwilling to release it for housing until they recoup the losses they made in the financial crash. Again, if we increase the power of local council, allowed them to buy the existing use value, they could move in here, buy it and build houses, and that's what we really need to do. Thank you very much.
Wow. Can I just ask Gavin, will Andy's speech be available as a sort of actual artefact, to put it online somewhere?
There's a live stream that's going out, and then I'm going to edit each presentation and put that
Right,
out.
okay.
So it's all live there now, but there'll be sections labelled.
Yeah, hello dead people, it's been great to have you here. Quite a frisky bunch of corpses. The point of that being that, if like me even, and I have heard a lot of what Andy said before, your mind is reeling at the amount of information you've just taken in there, you can go back and listen to it again, and also pass it on to people, because I'm sure you can think of a lot of people right now that you'd love to have right beside you, and that the whole purpose of having the great input from Democracy TV is to make that possible. So, right, questions for Andy, and then we're out. So come on folks, if you've got them, do not hold back. Right, we've got Chris at the back. Have we got anyone en route? The gentleman here, and we'll work our way back up the back. This is it.
Thank you. I'm Andrew Thompson from Comrie. For better or worse, I'm the secretary of our community council, and I was very struck by something that Lesley wrote in the National a couple of weeks ago about the point that Andy was making about how our democracy, local democracy, is defunct. And you asked the question, what were community councils for? And it struck me that you hit the nail exactly on the head. I, as the secretary of my local community council, am completely distracted as an activist, which is what you suggested they were for. And going back to what Andy was saying about what we need to do in terms of getting back local democracy, seems to me that we ought to be looking for a trade-off to get back to our real municipalities with powers and use the abolition of community councils as the trade-off to achieve that as a package. Because there's a lot of people that think that community councils are valuable and they sit on them and talk about dog shit from one week's end to the next. But if we got rid of them and brought back something more meaningful, we might actually get some useful, constructive things done within our communities.
Can we just take a couple of points and then we'll answer what seems to be appropriate, although for Andy, since he's an MSP, it'll all be appropriate. Right, whichever way you want to go, Sally, don't worry. Yep. And there has to now be 2 women asking questions. Good, it always works. Next, last there.
Well, thanks. Yeah, Chris Cook. I'm very sad. I'm interested in agreements and finance and funding and stuff like that. And I've been working for a few years on resilience, which is essentially bottom-up human resilience and resource resilience, which is keeping the lights on. And that brings in independence in a sense. If you've got the land, you've got the people, you've got the resources, why precisely do you need funding from a bank to do anything with them? You don't. You need agreements and you need instruments, and that's my background. And I just observed 2 things from what I've heard earlier, sort of to do with work I've been looking at. What was there before banks even existed? What forms of tenure have always been around? And I was a member of a housing co-op in London for 10 years. It's one of my experiments I was actually part of. And I observed that I didn't own the place I was in. I didn't lease the place I was in. I didn't have a 6-month short hold tenancy. I didn't have any form of license. I occupied that place through my membership of a friendly society, if you remember those. And it's quite possible to imagine occupation through membership and participation of corporate, non-toxic corporate bodies. That's what I'm working on in the Lithgow and in many other places too. That's one thing. And the second thing is, I mentioned instruments. Well, how do you fund things? Well, we heard earlier in relation to the field, our friend John Small was issuing wooden tokens, which were essentially prepayments for use of the land. Well, they're called tally sticks, those things. They've been around for 500 years. They're records of how the kings funded themselves through prepayment of land use or rentals or taxes for 500 years. You've heard the expression tax return, everybody? That was the return of the token to the exchequer for cancellation. You've heard the expression rate of return. It's the rate at which you could return those tokens to the exchequer for cancellation. And you've heard of stock. It was called the stock. That token was called the stock. So there's nothing new under the sun. These forms of funding have always been around. These forms of agreement have always been around. I'm interested in how we can actually mobilise these bottom up to actually do what we want to do. And I'm convinced we can. Thank you very much.
Right, thanks, Chris. There was another gentleman down there before we went.
It's Adrian. I've got a woman here.
Yes, okay, I'm sorry, I'll have to wait. Yep.
Hi, I was.
What's your name?
It's Alison, and I'm from the kind of Aberfeldy, Stratty area. So we've got quite a lot of estates around about where we are. The question I want to ask Andy is, on a practical level, I've noticed that over the last couple of years, a lot of the routes, the walking routes, have been fenced off, and not just fenced off, but electrified fences. So on a practical level, what can local residents do, and who do we speak to about trying to resolve those difficulties?
Right. Okay, Adrian's still going to have to wait because there's a lass in the middle here somewhere that put her hand up. Where was it? Yourself. Yes, you're a lass. Right, just hold on a minute. While you're getting the mic to you, Alison with the big voice at the top, you wanted to ask something?
Yeah, it would just be helpful for me if, and you might say something about the change in succession law.
Okay.
I just wanted to second what you said about information. Because I'm organising this meeting about women and land distribution, I was doing a wee bit of research, or I was trying to, and if you Google women and land, or women and land ownership, or women and access to land, or anything like that, you get tons and tons of stuff about Vietnam and Malawi and Tanzania, and I'm all in favour of these places having fantastic access for women to land, but it's actually very hard to find anything about Scotland and land, and actually we've got just as big problems.
Right, whoa, okay, right, lass.
Okay, Andy, it was just to ask, I suppose everybody knows that yesterday was Hiroshima Day. Oh, Hiroshima Day, and I'm interested to know how much land the MOD owns in Scotland, and whether this would be affected by Crown Lands purchase. And I'm thinking also to think about DTAS and what Craig was saying about harm to the community. I'm thinking about Fastlane and the naval base. So it's a bit of a carry your kite, but I'm just interested in how that might be affected.
What's your name?
Mary.
Mary. I think you could get the hum of interest into it. That's a stoker. Right, and finally, Adrian, down here for this round. We'll have another round, so if you've got other questions, keep them, because we'll do this one more time and then we're out. Yep, Adrian.
Adrian Davis. I'm an ecologist, and I've been very fortunate over the last sort of 30 years to almost have a license to roam, if you like, over many parts of Scotland. In fact, I've consulted Andy on various number of things like wildcats over the years for access for information. But what has become very apparent to me is how over the sort of history of time, and particularly since clearances and the history of the land, how much it's changed on maps, and how the environmental aspect of our land has changed as well. And in fact, looking back historically speaking, from an ecological point of view, biodiversity was probably at a much greater level 100 years ago, with the variety of different agricultural regimes, less intensification, and far more owners of land in community ownership. And in fact, having carried out many surveys over the last sort of 20 years, how that has changed and how poorly the land has been managed, in fact, over probably the last 40, 50 years.
So Adrian, just in the interest of time, have you got a question, or is that just an observation about
that? It's really just an observation, but it'd be interesting to get Andy's view and thought about the general environmental aspects.
Okay, right. Andy, take it away. You made notes of them all, don't I need to remind you them? You've just picked the whole thing up.
Okay. Right, so the first question from Andrew about community councils. I won't sort of repeat things here, but I think this is a question that people need to engage with. There's not an appetite in government to do this. For the first time since 1999, if you look at the Scottish Government's website and you look at the responsibilities of the Cabinet Secretaries, for the first time since 1999, the responsibility of the Cabinet Secretary for local government, it doesn't just say local government, it says reform of local government. Now, we've no idea what reform they have in mind, other than that they wish to share their statutory responsibility for delivering education between existing local authorities and schools, and that they want to what they call push down some functions to communities in inverted commas. Now, I think we're getting to the limits of what communities in inverted commas can do, and we need statutory powers for communities. Hardwired into the system. You can still do lots of voluntary stuff, but it needs to be hardwired into the system. So I think this is a debate that people need to engage with. Now, just finally, observe, of course, that community councils came out of the 1973 abolition of local government because folk in Maybole and Kirriemuir and stuff were pissed off that they were going to be losing everything, including their common good funds. And so as a sort, the government said, well, we'll give you community councils. And then they said, so can we keep all the property there? And they said, no, you can't keep the property, but we'll give you the right to be consulted. And that's where community councils came from. They came from a bad place. They were a concession and a stop. And in my view, they should just be eliminated, like the speculative volume house building industry. Just eliminate them. They are completely, utterly meaningless. Having said that, they could provide the structure from which to build something better, but I'm a bit of a revolutionary. I think things are best swept away often. Second, the question about new models. Absolutely. I think the kind of a lot of the models around about kind of occupation and about sharing resources and putting in resources and taking out what you need and getting away from this whole notion of private property is a very profound one. I think it's going to be really important for the future of the Scottish economy. I think if we're going to have an independent Scotland, for example, and we're going to grow this economy, we need to get away from speculative land value capture. We must do it. Housing must be much more affordable. And if we can do that, we will liberate about 30% of household income for doing other things. Spending in the local economy, investing, like in Germany, where 70% of German banks are co-op and mutual banks. So Germans save their income in mutual banks, which invest in German industry to create high-paid jobs for those same German people who pay decent taxes to provide high-quality public services. Alison's questions about walking routes, Perth and Kinross Council Access Officer, that is their statutory job. If they're not doing their job, take it up with the councillors. If they're not doing their job, get involved in the local government elections next year, make it an election issue, organise a hustings and ask which party is going to deal with access issues in Aberfeldy or whatever. Get active, get involved. 2017 is a massive opportunity to create real change in this country, because a lot of the stuff that people depend on and a lot of the statutory powers for doing useful stuff, much of those powers not being exercised much at all, lie with local government, and we need to take back control. That's an interesting phrase. We need to take back control of the democratic process at the so-called local level as fast as we can. I think that's a big opportunity next year that everyone should embrace. Succession, yes, there's absolutely heaps of literature around gender and land around the world. What was mediated through succession and inheritance law. Of course, we had primogeniture in Scotland. The eldest male son inherits until the 1964 Succession Act. After that, primogeniture was abolished, but children were not given the legal right to inherit property. And that's exactly the same today. Children do not have the legal right to inherit property. If my parents own 1,000 acres of land, I've got no right to claim any of it. They can give it to the Edinburgh Cat Dog Home, they can give it to the Our Land campaign. They don't own 1,000 acres, by the way, but... So, now there's a reform underway, there's a consultation being out, it's closed now, and there will be a succession bill in this Parliament. Historically, through the 20th century, the people who put the kibosh on children getting any legal rights to inherit property, and that particularly discriminates against women, the people who put the kibosh on that are landowners and farmers. Read the chapter in my book, you'll see the historical evidence of that, and it's exactly the same today. So that in the government consultation, there's weaselly words about how farmers and the agricultural industry has drawn attention to problems that might come with the economic viability of farms. Utter nonsense. The co-op farms were owned by hundreds of thousands of co-op members. They were economically viable, even though they were owned by hundreds of thousands of people. The question about the scale of management, the appropriate management, the economics of management are around management, not ownership. So I would get stuck into that succession bill when it comes forward. The MOD, if you want to find out how much land the MOD ask them, write to the MOD estates and ask them. I did, and I published it in my book, so you can find out there, but it's maybe 4 years out of date. Fast lane in places, I mean, these places are out of bounds. I mean, even the devolution of the Crown Estate is going to exempt defence estates. Defence remains a very sensitive issue for the UK government, as does the Fast Lane nuclear base. There's not much one can do about that. Well, there are things one can do about that, but we'll maybe visit that another day. And finally, on the ecology, yes, I mean, I would agree. I mean, I think as Lesley was talking about the Lochgarry tree project and stuff, we have a severely ecologically degraded landscape in many ways, and one of the big challenges is to restore it. And one of the interesting things is, I mean, I did a report on intensification of groundwater management last year, and one of the claims I made was that public money by the way of agricultural subsidies is subsidising grouse shooting, and I was shot down in flames by landowners and people who said it's complete and utter nonsense. There was a film put out recently, and I saw the factor of a leading grouse shooting estate admit that they'd commissioned a wildlife survey on those parts of the estate that did not carry domestic livestock. And this was a condition for receiving the basic payment scheme. So he was admitting that on those parts of the estate where they shoot grouse, they get basic payments in return for submitting an environmental survey. One thing I'm going to be doing in the next couple of months is pressurising government to make all those surveys in the public domain, because we're giving vast sums of public money in return for a survey. I want to see those surveys made public. I want them done up to a high standard, and that should provide us with a most incredible baseline, actually, hopefully, of ecological data across Scotland.
Righty. Just to chat a few thoughts on that as well, on the local democracy front, since I think you asked me at the start. This is just a very short 30-second history lesson that sort of demonstrates quite a lot about the connection between land ownership and democracy. In 1814, the Norwegians were part of Denmark. Denmark went into the war behind Napoleon. Napoleon got gubbed, they got gubbed, and they got the stuff taken off for them. And for a wee while, Norway thought it was going to be independent. So the Prince of Norway at the time summoned 112 men, because it was them kind of days, to a place called Eidsvoll, and they wrote a new constitution in 5 weeks flat, which was pretty frisky because it came in the wake of the French and American revolutions, but it had one pretty standard clause in it, which was that it enfranchised all landowners, which at the time were all men, male landowners. And overnight, 45% of the men in Norway got the vote. And that really revolutionised Norway. The reason that we see it as it is today is because from that time in 1814, even though it, for them, sadly, became then part of the Union of Crowns with Sweden, so basically it was run by the Swedes until 1905, their constitution change the nature of their democracy by giving everyone who had a stake in the land a vote. And because so many people owned land in Norway, that created the kind of democracy that we see today. Compare and contrast, if you will, Britain. In 1832, the Reform Act here gave 5% of men the vote. And you see the working out of that over time, because we are almost, we look and it's really hard to catch up now with what the Norwegians have had for the best part of 2 centuries. So, a lot of these things are pretty stuck looking, but urgent to unstick structurally. And my worry, along with Andy's obviously now he's an MSP, he's a member of the Green Party. I'm not an MSP or a member of any party, and I worry that the SNP have not got this at all. And that people who are in the SNP, perhaps here today, perhaps the millions still watching, really need to understand that we, the rest of Scotland, are waiting for you to push. I see we've had the agenda for the SNP conference out. There's not a mention of local democracy. And I happen to know that 3 constituencies pushed to have some fundamental discussion of local democracy included. Last year, land reform was also not really put through, even though, again, there's folk in the room who put through motions and emergency motions trying to raise Andrew Stollart's case, trying to say the land reform wasn't radical enough. And what happened was that the SNP did get a very unusual bloody nose, or perhaps just a slightly red nose, over that one, when the conference referred back a slightly self-congratulatory motion. And this year, I'm sure they've learnt, there won't be any hostages to fortunes like that, but we have to start pushing to get this kind of local issue on the go. And as far as your point, Andrew, about community councils, I'm with Andy. The Community Empowerment Act that Linda was speaking about could have tackled community councils, but it neither decided to knock them on the head and put them out of their misery, or give them some sort of statutory power so that they would mean something. Instead, they limp on with an average annual income of £400 a year, which has to be spent on stationery. You are having a joke. And that joke is what we put up with in lieu of powerful local democracy.
And
so
more importantly, no right to own property.
Yes, well, no right to do no statutory right to be actually consulted on anything, and no right to own property. That's debatable, actually. There's plenty of unincorporated bodies that do own, like Cosla, for example, is in the same situation as a community council, and it owns Haymarket House. But you see that the way that people have been made to think about community councils is that they are useless. And in fact, the reason a lot of people set up development trusts is because they legally can own property, and it's there that a lot of practical people spend their time, and community councils are the losers. So there's a whole thing that we need to get into yet of that, and it may seem to have little connection to land, but in the end these things are very strongly connected. Enough of me. Right, so we're just going to have one more round of questions and then we'll be off. Right, where's the microphone? And remember, we've got to have gals, because otherwise you don't get to ask questions. Yep, there's a gentleman here.
It's all men.
It's not quite, no. But we need one more woman or else we can't get more guys. I see you.
I was talking to a friend who's a farmer who leases land. And we talked about the Stoddart case. Sorry, can you hear okay? The Stoddart case, and there's going to be changes in that. There's a possibility of the assignation of leases. But our neighbour has spoken about that, and his opinion is that he's heard from other estates and landowners that what they're doing is clawing back the leases and moving to contracts with farmers, so they're not allowing them to maintain their lease on the land, but they'll move over to a contract negotiation. So that then would be sort of a way of the landowner getting round allowing the leaseholder to assign the lease and maintain continuity on the land. Do you know anything about that?
Yep, okay, we've got that one. Hector?
Hi, I'm Hector McLean. I am a landowner. I am a factor. I have factored in every county in Scotland, so I regret to say I have probably at some stage or other factored in a county on land near you. Perhaps a saving grace, I may be one of the few folk in this room that actually met John McEwen and had tea in his house. I'm amazed how much I actually agree with what Andy said. I disagree fundamentally with a lot of what he said, and with regard to the very last question, I think the successive parliaments have made such a bog of agricultural legislation that the only beneficiaries are folk like myself, factors and lawyers. That's a whole different subject. I just have some random thoughts. I do wonder how the Highland Perthshire Community Trust will fancy a tax on land. And I do wonder if folk have actually appreciated the hard work that obviously they have put in, Kerry folk have put in, and the general impression I know as a landowner, I know as a factor, and they know from doing it, is that looking after land is bloody hard work. And simply getting ownership of it never actually seems to me to be the answer. These two trusts, or not them, but the Kerry and I forget which other one it was, Burnham, they have not needed to own their land. They get on perfectly well with good leases. And the moral, for me, in those two instances, is it's so much a question of discussion and negotiation and looking at opportunities. Having compulsory powers in the background is probably a very good thing and a good stick, but it really isn't the be-all and end-all. And I do wonder what the people are going to do with, is it 5 million acres, the Scottish Land Mass? Andy will correct me if I'm wrong. What they're actually going to do with it. Where I live, which is only 10 miles out of Kerry, up a glen, and it is considered wilderness. I suspect that most of the Kirrymerians have never dared come up there. In terms of invitations, we go down to Kerry. Folk don't venture up because it's too far and they're frightened. I have offered 2 acres of the best land, it was the Mansion House Garden, for the last 30 years for free. No ifs, no buts, no give me the produce or anything. And for 10 of those years, it was very well gardened by market gardeners. For 10 years, it had a series of nutters in it, and for 10 years, nothing's happened to it. The Mansion House, we've been offering it to various charitable bodies over the years, again for free. We actually thought we had a deal a few months ago to a charitable body, again for free. I even got a windfall with some carbon trading to throw that, which is a very significant sum in, to help. They decided it was going to be too hard work, and I don't hold this against them. It is hard work. Looking after a lot of the wilderness that comprises a lot of Scotland is hard bloody work. There's going to be a change in land ownership patterns for no other reason, because a lot of landowners, their next generation, don't want it. They don't want the hard work that actually goes with it. It's my next door neighbour sold up. I know of at least half a dozen folk like myself with inherited estates. They are selling up because they don't want the hard work. So please do not underrate the hard work that you are taking on when you want land. It's not the be-all and end-all. I happen to think that a development land tax, or if you're talking, is a very good idea. Rating empty property or taxing land, I think is a very bad idea. But good luck with it.
Okay, thanks Hector. And can I just thank you for asking the questions. It's not easy to be, well, I don't know, maybe you're not the only landowner in the room, but obviously it's a bit of a difficult one. And having Hector having told me out of the aforementioned Glen Prosen on one occasion, I can testify it's kind of hard to get to. But on the other hand, extremely lovely. And if there was something up there that the public felt they could reach, I just have a feeling there would be more people that would come. But I mean, I don't know, the Kerry folk, where are you? Are you still here? Have you been up Glen Prosen?
Yes.
Right, Sally, just hand the mic over, would you? Because you're going to ask a question anyway.
I have actually been in Hector's house once. So many years ago. And it is a beautiful area. I just want to pick up on the issue around local government reform. I happen to be the convener of the SNP branch in Kinnemuir, and we had a very successful event with Andy last year around land reform that was open to members of the public across the whole area, the whole political spectrum. And that's still being talked about. In October this year, we're having one around local government reform because precisely the reason that we're having the elections next year, we need to do things differently. And I feel really passionately about that. And I'm delighted that Lesley is going to be one of the keynote speakers for that. It's on Thursday, October the 26th in Kinnemuir Town Hall at 7 o'clock, so thanks for the wee plug. As a relatively new SNP member, I guess I just want to give some reassurance that there are lots of us who are working really hard to move the agenda in lots of very interesting and creative ways, lots of which are aligned with what we've heard today and are linked to the community empowerment, land reform agendas and the gender issue as well. So I really just wanted to make that point, that we are not complacent and we are trying to move that agenda forward. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much. Right, we have one other woman right down here. Oh, is another, sorry. Are you putting your hand up pretending to be a woman? Alright, well you've got to stop. No, I'm sorry, this is what it's like. You just have to wait with a two each. No, lady first.
Hello, I'm not going to give a name, but I'm local. It's to yourself, and it's to let you know that the contract farming, which seems to be the main way that people can rent a farm nowadays, locally 90%, it's split 90%, 10%. 90% of bills and things are paid by the contractor, who's not allowed to be called a farmer, because the estate is the farmer's, ergo they get the subsidy. So they're locking up the land.
Yeah, that's what.
So I wasn't sure if you
Well, that's what I wanted clarification on that.
Right.
That was my feeling. It was a way of keeping the land.
Okay.
A conversation like this is of no use to anybody.
I appreciate it, and it's now over, right? People are allowed to be spontaneous. Can I just keep time? Okay, and the gentleman just before, I know this seems awfully unfair, but you were feeding into that thought. Have you got something to say about that? Business
Not particularly about that, but since you've given me an opportunity.
All right, let's have the microphone in quickly. Very quick though.
I would ask Andy, you have the secondary legislation and the guidance on the Community Empowerment Act seems to be taking forever to come forward. And in terms of democracy, and you did mention it yourself, we're pushing more and more down to communities, and particularly in participation requests. Now, I don't know if you're on the committee or not, but there's a real chance there that you can actually empower communities to focus on outcomes and give them the opportunity to bring something forward. I'd be interested in your opinion on it. Because at the moment, you're asking them to focus on outcomes, you're asking them to focus on improving services and all the rest of it, but not actually giving them any resources to deliver that.
Okay, I'm sure Andy will be the first to say he's not asking anything, unfortunately, but yes, he's in the Parliament. Right, and yes, the frustrated man. Who goes by the name of?
Alec Rowe. Yeah, Andy, you're talking about the land use, and I don't know, you must be aware that in November of last year, Forestry Commission Scotland brought out a report where they stated that they had provided just short of £1 billion to the Scottish Exchequer and provided employment for 25,000 people. Now, given that we have probably less than 15% of our forest cover, there's a potential there to increase that by a factor of 4 or 5. That would give us an increase of £4 billion to the economy and 125,000 jobs. I haven't seen anybody picking up on this. Have you got anything to say on it?
Okay, we'll just pass it over to Andy. As the man, somebody who's remembering here, that Andy had told a story, I don't know if this is right or not, that one of the moments where he decided he had to do something about the whole land issue was when he was working for the forestry and cutting some of the trees down at the Birks of Aberfeldy, which now are very birkless So forestry, I'm sure, will be right up his street. All of those, can you remember them all?
Okay, yeah, and I've got a note here. So the first question is about farming. So yeah, there's the Land Reform Act Part 10 provides a new framework for agricultural tenancy. I think there's a commitment amongst many politicians to go further. I think one of the issues in the agricultural structure in Scotland and the UK in general is that it has been concentrated in fewer and fewer hands, and yet at the same time more and more people want to get into agriculture, and you cannot square this circle. So ultimately you have to do something about providing opportunities for new people to come into farming, and I think one of those opportunities, for example, is putting a modest, decent cap on the amount of public subsidy you get. You know, £50,000 should be enough. And that will allow other people to come in and access more of the agricultural subsidy pot. We're intending to present to Parliament a refreshed Land Settlement Act. It's on the statute books already, 1919 Land Settlement Act. It was last used in the 1950s, but that provided for small holdings across Scotland. And we want to refresh that, bring it up to date, and use it, for example, to refresh the green belt. The green belt around Edinburgh and Glasgow is just sterile, it's doing nothing, and it's in the hands of speculators. I mean, that should be growing food, there should be smallholders, community gardens, there should be forests, there should be lakes, there should be cycle paths. That's the kind of thing we should have, you know, in and around Scotland's urban areas, and small holdings are part of that. So I think, you know, this is a debate that's not going to go away. I'm not going to answer your question in full. You're right that there's behaviour taking place out there that is not desirable. The key thing is to draw that to the attention of your local elected member of the Scottish Parliament in order that can inform debates going ahead in this Parliament on exactly what's happening. Hector, thank you for your various comments. I would disagree with you on tax. I mean, one of the interesting things about taxing land is it brings the capital value down. And this is the problem. Actually, it would mean that land didn't cost any more than it does. It would just mean that you'd be paying tax to a local authority and you'd be paying less money as a transfer payment to the previous owner. You'd get into the situation that kind of leasehold reform is like. In fact, we did a calculation that if you doubled the council tax, house prices would come down to the extent that your interest payments to the bank would be reduced by more than the increased amount of council tax you're paying. So you'd save money. And that's how the whole question of tax capitalisation works. I mean, that's why agricultural land is so expensive, because we took off the non-domestic rates. Now, if you take off the rating of property, what happens is land values rise and it becomes capitalised. That's exactly why the small business bonus scheme is a bad idea. There's coverage in the Sunday Herald of that. And I asked a parliamentary question the other week. The Scottish Government's done no economic assessment of the impact of that. It's cost us over £1 billion. And it's a carte blanche giveaway to thousands and thousands of small businesses, some of whom deserve it, some of whom don't. And the target for community-owned land is 1 million acres. I don't happen to agree with that target. We don't have time to go into why I don't agree with it. One of the reasons I don't agree with it was that it was dreamt up with no consideration. It was dreamt up by Alex Salmond in a ministerial car on the way to a conference in Skye, where he was intending to announce the acquisition of the Cape Wrath Lighthouse. The MOD had been putting in problems about that. They thought it would be resolved by the time he was going to give the speech, and the speech was going to be about communities owning land from the Cape Wrath down to the Mull of Galloway, where they do own their lighthouse. But it had been delayed, so he needed an announcement to make, so they decided in the car to announce a target of 1 million acres. That's where it came from. I don't agree with it. I don't have time to go into it though. Mansion houses, yeah, I think mansion houses are a thing of the past. I think a lot of mansion houses were built that don't have any function anymore. I don't think we should be trying to find a use for these mansion houses necessarily. I mean, yeah, let's do it if we can find someone who run a hotel, but a lot of them should probably just be, you know, knocked down, actually. They were built for a different era. I welcome Kerry Muir's debate on local democracy, and I welcome the commitment of a member of the SNP. I think we've seen a welcome increase in the membership of all political parties in Scotland. And just as I would encourage people to get involved in local democracy and local elections, I'd also encourage you to get involved in trades unions, in community groups, in political parties, and raise the whole level of engagement and debate, because it's meetings like the one you're organising that actually spark interest and create the conditions, as I said right at the beginning of my talk, create the kind of movement that gives politicians the courage to make what are sometimes quite difficult decisions, which at the moment they're avoiding because of narrow electoral considerations. Secondary legislation, yes, in fact, I got the committee, I'm on the Local Government Communities Committee, and I got the clerk on Thursday to write to the Minister to ask for a timetable as to when the secondary legislation is going to be brought forward. Because Rosanna Cunningham has issued a timetable for her bit of it, but the Local Government Minister hasn't, so we'll find that soon. And finally, on land use and forestry, I mean, absolutely, there was £1 billion of value, a lot of jobs, and we could have a lot more forestry in this country. I think one of the problems is the way we do this. We basically, the state stepped in the name of the Forestry Commission and bought a lot of land. And since the sort of 60s and 70s, it's been the private sector that's been doing a lot of it. And the private sector isn't actually delivering the amount of forestry that the government wants. The government wants 10,000 hectares a year. We've never achieved that. I think we need a step change in how we do that. I think local government should be much more involved. I think communities should be much more involved. I did a report a few years ago on forest ownership in Scotland and showed that the distribution of ownership was heavily skewed towards a tiny number of people owning very large areas of forest, in direct contrast to 18 countries I reviewed across Europe, where the skew was in hundreds of thousands of people owning small areas of forest. So I think we want to expand community forestry, municipal forestry. If you go to France, 30% of the public forests are owned by the communes. If you go skiing in France, you'll almost certainly be skiing on municipal land that is managed by the local commune because they own the forests. And when alpine skiing came in the 50s and 60s, it was the municipalities who were first in and have generated, as you can imagine, vast income from the fact they've developed ski resorts. And I'm not suggesting that we should be developing ski resorts all over Scotland, but the point is the municipal ownership of land allowed them to do that. So I think forestry's got massive potential. We haven't properly, I'm advocating that Parliament does an inquiry into how to get forest expansion, because there was a study done a few years ago showing where it should go. We know where it should go. The problem is a lot of the land where the new forest should go is owned by sporting estates, and they don't want trees. So we've got to find some way of making sure that we get the trees in the places we want. Answer?
Right. Well, thank you so much for all of that, Andy. You always sort of worry in case Andy got accidentally sort of, I don't know, a stooky or something like that, and couldn't run around the place and do all the stuff he does, because so much is in your head, lad. But anyway, I hope it's inspired other people to get some of that stuff in their head from their own experience, because most of this arises from just your frustration that day in Aberfeldy and my own mother from Caithness, and it comes from your own experience, I think, to think that this is not all it could be. And then when you begin to look around, you see some pretty healthy examples of countries so like us and yet so unlike us. And a feeling with Scotland, whatever its constitutional destination, that it can be different. So we're kind of all part of that. I just wanted to point out a couple of things. Well, one of which is, you mentioned skiing there, whether or not people want to take that over. The folk who've got the Abbey Moor event together are trying to put together an idea for a community buyout of the ski lift, because they want to see better administration of it, and they think they know how. So actually, once you begin to think about how things run, you get quite ambitious. Now, the next events, we've still got our correspondent from Dunfermline at the top there, Anne. You've got a voice, and you've got sort of 5 taster events going on the 27th of August.
We have 8 actually. I wish we'd had the 9th, because it's the Lord that owns the pier that people can't use because it's falling apart. No, we've got 4 very successful community projects. But here's the bite. I want to know about the fight they had to get the land, and that's what they're being briefed on. We've also got a disused quarry where there's been 3 deaths of young people, and people want it kept as a kind of memorial. But we've got 2 divers with an excellent business plan. It's in receivership, so they're reclaiming that. But what we hope to do is culminate in a whole evening at Queen Anne High School, where we'll have 5 or 10 minutes from each event, which you can visit over the weekend. But the programme's all on Eventbrite, Ireland, and Ireland 5 as well.
Great, okay, so that's, if anybody's lurking in Dunfermline direction, that's all happening there. Haddington is also having an event the same day, that's the 27th of August, and the rest of these events that are like this one, with different local events, with the input of DTAS, with Andy Wightman and myself mostly, they're happening all around Scotland. So, check it out and tell other people. If you thought this was good, do say. And if you didn't, don't say. Right, can I just point out that there are still cakes for sale. As predicted, nobody managed to kind of work their way through what was on offer, so please do go for that. It would be nice if those who can afford it make some donation for the hall. We've given expenses to everybody like Gavin and Tommy and people who have come from a wee distance to get here and for the hall hire, so it helps us if you can stick a couple of quid in, and there's a bucket as you go out, so no excuses. And just really thanks to people who've made this happen, to all the stall holders who've come along and sat there with their goods, and indeed with all of the produce which has now been packed ready to go back elsewhere. To the speakers, a lot of people had to get quite exercised, nervous and focused to do this, because the beauty of this is actually sharing what seems local with national ideas. And it's great that you took the courage to do that, all you folk, the two lasses there and all the others, because that's the beginning of meshing politics with everyday life, and that's what we're here to do. So congratulations to all of you who spoke. Our singers were just stonking. Democracy TV, as ever, thank you so much, because not only have they been streaming, but when you get sort of bursts of completely useful stuff, that will still be there as an online artefact that you can check out and share. But most of all, thanks to Sally Broughton and Gillis McLean, who strangely are standing right here actually. Just to say that that is what makes these things tick. These two women incredibly didn't even know each other before this. They didn't know a Glen connected them, they didn't know their lives connected them, and they didn't know their hopes connected them. And they do now. So thank you.